The lights dimmed, the crowd settled, and the cameras rolled as Jason Statham walked onto the set of The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. The action star moved with his usual quiet confidence, his step steady, his expression unreadable. The audience erupted into applause, but Jason barely acknowledged it. He was here for a conversation, not a performance. Across the table, Lawrence O'Donnell leaned back in his chair, smirking. He had done this before, baiting guests, trapping them in his questions, twisting words to create headlines. Tonight, he had his next target. Jason took his seat, adjusting his jacket. He glanced at O'Donnell, then at the crowd. Something felt off. O'Donnell wasted no time. "Jason, let us be honest. You are known for playing the same tough guy in every film. Do you ever wonder if Hollywood sees you as nothing more than an action figure, someone to throw punches, not someone with real talent?" The audience tensed. Some chuckled, expecting Jason to fire back. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the hostility. Jason did not react. No shift in his posture. No change in his expression. His eyes locked onto O'Donnell's. O'Donnell smirked, mistaking Jason's silence for hesitation. But the crowd could feel it. This was not hesitation. This was calculation. Jason folded his hands together and leaned forward ever so slightly. The energy in the room shifted. The host had fired the first shot. But everyone could see it now. Jason Statham was not the one in the corner. What happened next would leave the world speechless. Before continue, like and subscribe to catch Jason Statham's epic face-off with Lawrence O'Donnell, and comment where you're watching from today. The studio was a well-oiled machine, lights beaming from every angle, multiple cameras positioned to capture every expression, every reaction. The audience, packed into neat rows, had been eager at first, anticipating an exciting interview with Jason Statham. But now, there was a noticeable shift in the air. Lawrence O'Donnell sat comfortably in his chair, legs crossed, a smug glint in his eye. He was in his element. This was his show, his territory. He had cornered celebrities, politicians, and public figures before, backing them into uncomfortable situations they could not escape. He thought tonight would be no different. Jason, on the other hand, was unreadable. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, his hands resting on his knees. He was not fidgeting, not adjusting his seat, not forcing a laugh. He just watched. His silence was not submission. It was patience. O'Donnell glanced at the monitor, ensuring the cameras were locked onto their faces. His audience expected a spectacle, and he was ready to deliver. "So, Jason," O'Donnell continued, leaning in, his voice smooth yet pointed, "you have made a career out of playing the same type of character, silent, brooding, throwing a few punches, and walking away without much dialogue. Do you ever worry that maybe Hollywood does not really see you as an actor?" The audience chuckled uneasily. A few murmured. They had seen O'Donnell do this before, pose a question laced with subtle insult, wrapped in just enough professionalism to seem legitimate. Jason did not react. He exhaled slowly, barely noticeable, but his eyes remained locked on O'Donnell. He was studying him. O'Donnell smirked, misinterpreting the silence. He adjusted his cuffs, continuing, let us be fair. De Niro, Pacino, even younger guys like Joaquin Phoenix or Adam Driver, they push boundaries. They challenge themselves. You stay in your lane. Do you ever feel limited? A few audience members winced at the question. It was not curiosity. It was bait. And yet, Jason did not bite. Instead, he reached for his glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed it back down. O'Donnell's smirk grew. He thought he had shaken him. Nothing to say? O'Donnell prodded. His voice carried a hint of amusement, masking the pressure he was applying. Jason sighed through his nose, tilting his head slightly. You done? His voice was low, steady. The audience fell silent. O'Donnell raised an eyebrow. He had expected an argument, a defensive response. He was prepared to pick apart excuses, mock attempts at justification. But Jason was not making excuses. He was not justifying anything. He was waiting. And in that moment, the balance began to shift. The audience sensed it. O'Donnell, despite his performance, felt it too. Jason Statham was not here to be cornered. He was here to end the game before it even started. Lawrence O'Donnell adjusted his tie, his confidence growing. The silence that followed his question was all too familiar. It was the moment when guests, cornered and unsure, tried to find the right words. It was the moment where O'Donnell tightened the noose. He gave a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Come on, Jason, surely you have thought about it." He leaned forward, voice laced with condescension. "I mean, you are a talented guy, no doubt. But let us be honest, Hollywood does not exactly hand you scripts with deep, emotional monologues, do they?" A few audience members chuckled. The setup was clear. O'Donnell was trying to paint Jason as a one-dimensional performer, someone Hollywood tolerated, not respected. Jason did not react. His fingers tapped against the armrest. Slow, deliberate. O'Donnell took that as hesitation and pressed forward. "I mean, there is a reason why people do not compare you to the likes of Daniel Day-Lewis or Christian Bale, right? Those guys transform. You stay in your comfort zone. Ever wonder if that is because Hollywood does not think you can handle anything else?" The audience was no longer laughing. Some glanced at Jason, waiting. The shift was happening. They wanted to see how he would respond. Jason inhaled slowly, his posture still relaxed. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Lawrence," he said, "tell me something. How many times have you been punched in the face?" A murmur ran through the crowd. O'Donnell blinked. "Excuse me." Jason tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I am asking," he said smoothly, "how many times have you been in a real fight? Not a debate, not an argument, an actual fight. One where you had to get back up after being knocked down." O'Donnell let out a small, nervous laugh. "Jason, this is not about. It is a simple question." The studio was dead silent. O'Donnell shifted slightly in his seat. "Well, I suppose, never." Jason nodded once. "Thought so." O'Donnell frowned, realizing the audience was now hanging on Jason's every word. Jason leaned forward, his tone measured. "See, Lawrence, you and I do different things. You sit in a chair and talk for a living. You poke at people, try to get a reaction. That is your craft. Mine. I get thrown through windows. I get hit by cars. I have broken more bones than I can count. And I keep getting back up. You say I play the same role? Maybe. But do you know why people keep coming to see it?" O'Donnell said nothing. Jason's gaze was unwavering. "Because they know it is real. When I take a hit, they feel it. When I get back up, they feel that too. And that." He gestured toward the audience. "That is why they keep watching. Because I am not pretending." A few people in the crowd clapped softly. O'Donnell opened his mouth, but Jason was not finished. "You compare me to actors who transform for a role. You think being great means losing weight for a part or putting on a different accent. But let me ask you this, Lawrence. When was the last time one of those guys had to actually fight for something?" O'Donnell's lips pressed together. The crowd was no longer on his side. Jason leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You say I play the same character. Maybe. Or maybe I just do not need to pretend to be someone else to make an impact." The first real cheers broke out in the audience. O'Donnell glanced around, clearly caught off guard. But Jason was not finished. He adjusted his cuff and continued, his voice steady, unshaken. "Now, let me ask you a question, Lawrence." O'Donnell blinked. The shift was happening faster than he could control. "You have been in this industry for a long time. Sat across from some of the biggest names. You have built a career on asking tough questions, making people uncomfortable. So tell me." Jason's eyes locked onto his. "Is that what you will be remembered for?" The audience fell into a hushed silence. O'Donnell stiffened. Jason gave him room to respond. But O'Donnell had no answer. The air in the room was different now. The momentum had shifted. Jason Statham had just turned the interview on its head. The moment lingered in the air, heavy and unshaken. O'Donnell had no immediate response. He had walked into this interview with a clear agenda, to break Jason Statham down, to expose some imagined vulnerability. But now he was the one being studied. O'Donnell cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. The controlled confidence he had at the start of the interview was cracking. He needed to regain control. "That is an interesting perspective, Jason," he said, forcing a smirk. "But let us not get carried away. We are talking about acting here, not survival training. Hollywood is about storytelling. And some would argue that great storytelling comes from transformation, not just throwing punches." Jason tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Transformation," he repeated. "That is a nice word, Lawrence. But let me ask you, what exactly do you transform into when you sit in that chair and tear people down for a living?" The audience inhaled sharply. O'Donnell's fingers twitched slightly against his cue cards. He tried to shake it off with a light chuckle. "Come on, Jason. I am just doing my job." "Your job," Jason interrupted, his voice measured, "is to create drama. You invite people onto your show, set them up with loaded questions, push them until they react. And when they do, you sit back and act surprised. But what happens when the roles are reversed, Lawrence?" O'Donnell's jaw tensed. The audience could see it now. Jason was not raising his voice, not getting defensive, not playing into the game. He was simply exposing the truth. Jason leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His voice dropped slightly, the tone lower, sharper. "You asked me if I ever feel like Hollywood does not respect me. But let me ask you something, Lawrence. Do you respect the people you bring on this show?" O'Donnell opened his mouth, but Jason was not finished. "Or do you just wait for them to slip up so you can make a headline out of it?" The audience was dead silent. O'Donnell's smirk had vanished completely now. He glanced at the teleprompter, at the crew behind the cameras, as if searching for an escape route. Jason let the silence sit. And then, he delivered the final cut. "You see, Lawrence, I may throw punches for a living, but at least I know when to take a hit and keep moving. You." Jason gestured toward him, his voice unwavering. "You hide behind a desk, behind cameras, behind carefully edited scripts. You never take the punches. You just throw them at people who cannot hit back." The audience erupted. Some clapped. Some cheered outright. The energy in the studio had flipped entirely. O'Donnell was rattled. This was not how this was supposed to go. He had expected Jason to play defense, maybe crack a joke to deflect the heat. But instead, Jason had turned the entire interview against him. The host forced a tight smile, shifting in his chair. "All right," O'Donnell said, his voice strained. "You have made your point. But I do have to ask." He flipped through his cue cards, desperate for something, anything to regain control. His fingers landed on a new angle. "Your background," he said quickly, "is something a lot of people admire. You grew up in working-class London. Your father was a street vendor. Your mother worked multiple jobs. Do you ever wonder if maybe, just maybe, you were never meant to be here? That the industry gave you a chance out of luck?" Jason inhaled slowly, his expression turning to something colder, sharper. The audience felt the shift. O'Donnell had taken the personal route. A cheap move. A desperate move. Jason clasped his hands together, nodding once. O'Donnell thought he had found a weakness. He had not. He had just given Jason the perfect setup. Jason Statham sat motionless, his hands clasped together, his eyes locked onto Lawrence O'Donnell. The host had made his final move, digging into Jason's past, trying to frame his success as an accident, a fluke of luck rather than earned respect. The audience could feel the weight of the moment. Jason exhaled through his nose, slowly, his posture unwavering. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, precise, sharp enough to cut through the silence. "You know, Lawrence," Jason said, tilting his head slightly, "I have heard this before. The idea that I was not meant to be here. That where I come from, people do not make it. That my success is some kind of mistake. O'Donnell leaned back slightly. The shift was happening. Jason continued. But here is the thing, mate. Success is not about what you are meant for. It is about what you fight for. The audience erupted in applause. O'Donnell forced a smile, but his fingers twitched as he shuffled his cue cards. Jason leaned forward, never breaking eye contact. I was not born into money. I did not have connections. I did not have someone in Hollywood handing me scripts, telling me I was the next big thing. I worked. I hustled. I built my career the hard way. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The audience was fully engaged now, not just entertained, but invested. You sit there, Lawrence, and talk about luck like it is the only reason people like me make it. But you forget, Jason gestured toward the crowd, millions of people out there have had harder lives than me. People who were told they would never make it. People who worked day and night for a chance at something better. O'Donnell shut his mouth. Jason shook his head, his voice dropping lower. And the worst thing you can tell someone like that is that they were never meant to succeed. The room fell completely silent. Jason leaned back, resting his hands on the chair's armrests, his expression cool, unreadable. O'Donnell looked away for the first time all night. The host had spent his career grilling guests, exposing weaknesses, controlling the conversation. But now he was exposed. The audience saw it. The balance of power had completely shifted. Jason continued, his tone firm but steady. You want to talk about luck, Lawrence? You sit in this chair, on this stage, with the safety of cameras and producers around you. You get to judge people from a distance, never knowing what it feels like to actually be in the fight. That is luck. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. O'Donnell was visibly uncomfortable. His confidence, which had been unshakable at the start, was fading fast. Jason watched him for a long moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. But let me tell you something. O'Donnell lifted his gaze. Jason locked eyes with him. Luck has never won a fight. Hard work has. The audience exploded into applause. Some people stood up, cheering. Others simply sat, stunned. O'Donnell looked lost. His carefully crafted attack had been turned against him, dismantled in seconds. The host cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. Well, he muttered, forcing a chuckle, you certainly have a way with words, Jason. Jason just sat back, watching him. The fight was already over. The audience was no longer watching an interview. They were witnessing a reckoning. Jason Statham sat back in his chair, his eyes still locked onto Lawrence O'Donnell, his expression unreadable. He had given him every chance to regain control. O'Donnell had taken his shots. He had tried to bait Jason, tried to twist the narrative, tried to maintain his dominance. But now, he had nothing left. Jason exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the armrest. Then, he leaned in one final time. Lawrence, he said, his voice smooth, steady, you have spent your whole career asking the tough questions, making people uncomfortable, holding them accountable. O'Donnell stiffened. So tell me. Jason's eyes never wavered. When you look back at your life, at all the interviews, all the headlines, all the moments like this, what do you see? Silence. O'Donnell blinked. The words hit like a freight train. His lips parted slightly, as if searching for something, anything to say. But there was nothing. The audience felt it too. The smugness was gone. The control was gone. The well-rehearsed confidence had evaporated. For the first time in his career, Lawrence O'Donnell was speechless. Jason did not press him. He did not smirk, did not gloat, did not celebrate. He simply waited. The air in the room was thick, unmoving. A single cough echoed from somewhere in the crowd. Someone else shifted uncomfortably in their seat. O'Donnell's fingers twitched against his cue cards. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Jason watched him. Then, with the same calm, controlled tone he had used all night, He leaned back in his chair. "That is what I thought." A single clap echoed from the back of the room. Then another. And then the studio erupted. The crowd roared. Some stood, cheering, clapping, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others simply sat there, stunned, watching as O'Donnell sat frozen in his chair. The moment had already gone viral. Jason had said all he needed to say, and Lawrence O'Donnell had nothing left to give. The applause thundered through the studio, but Jason Statham did not wait for it. Without a word, he stood up, reached for his mic, and unhooked it. He placed it calmly on the table, adjusted his jacket, and turned toward the exit. No final remark. No victory pose. Because he did not need one. As Jason walked off stage, the cameras remained locked on Lawrence O'Donnell, still sitting there, frozen. His fingers hovered over his cue cards, his mouth slightly open as if he might speak, but he never did. The audience kept cheering, clapping, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some stood, others simply watched, absorbing what had just happened. A close-up shot captured O'Donnell's stunned face, his own show, his own stage, and yet, he had never felt smaller. And as the screen faded to black, one thing was certain: this was the night Jason Statham owned the room.